mean shit to us. Y'all been threatening us since Birmingham. I ain't seen shit. When is July the 4th? And all you scary ass Negroes that pass that shit around. Look at what the fuck you did. You made blacks come out. I don't see no white militia. So to the boogie boys, the 3%ers, and all the rest of these scared ass rednecks, we here. Where the fuck you at? We in your house. Let's go. NFAC, motherfucker.
All right, everyone, there is a video going on around the internet right now, and it's showing a bunch of black separatists holding guns dressed in military attire. They claim to be an organization called the NFAC, which stands for Not Effing Around Coalition. That's what they call themselves. They are a black separatist movement that wants to establish a black ethno-state, specifically in Texas. Which I don't know how the hell they're ever going to manage to do that, given the culture of the state of Texas. But if they ever tried doing that, it would be a bloodbath. Their leader is a guy who calls himself Grandmaster J. Now, Grandmaster J, he says that he is a veteran of the U.S. military, and he also claims that all of the members of the, and I'm trying to get this acronym right, the NFAC. He claims that all of the members of the NFAC are veterans and that they all are experts at shooting. They all know how to fire guns. They know about military tactics because they were trained by the U.S. military. Now, looking at the ideology of this group, I spent some time researching this. It turns out that they are black Israelites. There is a video of Grandmaster J talking with his followers, and they're all holding guns, in a place called Stone Mountain, which is in Georgia. And Grandmaster J is talking about the 12 tribes of Israel and how for 400 years the United States enslaved the tribes of Israel. So what we are dealing with are Hebrew Israelites. These people are the ones who believe that the ancient Hebrews was black, and Moses was black, and Jesus was black. King David was black, Solomon was black, and all the Hebrews was black, and all the Hebrew slaves was black, and when they was migrating from Egypt into Canaan, they was all black. They was all Africans because they came from Africa, because of people are living in Africa, for obviously they was African. And the Mississippi Delta is actually the Nile, man. That's Egypt right there, because the original inhabitants of America, they was all black. So so what we're dealing with, ideologically speaking, are a bunch of heretics. They think that the Hebrews were all black. And they are also obsessed with Egypt. If you look at the leader of this group, Grandmaster J, he's always talking about Egypt. He likes to wear that Egyptian sort of cross figure that a lot of Hotep and Kemet guys like to wear. The Kemets are essentially black neo-pagans. They aspire to bring back the pagan African religion. And it really is all just racism. This is the black equivalent of the white neo-pagans who want to bring back Odin worship, and they want to establish a white ethno-state and all that stuff. I find it also fascinating that the leader of this paramilitary group claims that all of his members are veterans, that they are all ex-military guys. I find this interesting because during the Cold War, NATO conducted an operation called Gladio. Essentially, it was about sparking violence between the right and the left in order to stoke nationalist sentiments within Europe. Essentially, if left-wing terrorists committed violence, that would stoke nationalist fury during the Cold War. It was a psyop that was done in order to spark nationalist feelings of racism, feelings of hatred against Russia within NATO against the Soviet Union. And if you look at the paramilitaries that were involved in the Gladio operations, because NATO intelligence agencies armed, trained, and backed a lot of right-wing fighters. and they also worked with veterans. They worked with ex-military guys. And you can read about the Gladio operation in Italy, which was really the center of the Gladio operation. And you will find out that a number of the guys who were operatives for Gladio were in fact veterans. So I find that very interesting. Now you can say, well, Ted, you really have no proof that what we're seeing is a strategy of tension, right? A strategy of tension. Basically, a strategy of tension is a method by which to spark violence between two political factions for the advancement of a particular goal. So you get the left to do something, it gets the right upset, the right does something, that brings the right wing up, and it also increases anti-communism. The left does something violent, that makes for great propaganda fodder against the left. You get what I'm trying to say. So you could argue and say, well, Ted, you have no evidence that what we're seeing is a strategy of tension. Well, I would say that this is a strategy of tension just by the very definition of the term. Because if you look at the video of Grandmaster Jay talking in Stone Mountain, he says, and I want to read to you guys this quote, he says, "I don't see no white militia, so to the boogie boys," talking about the Boogaloos, who are right-wing fanatics who want to overthrow the state and essentially manifest their right-wing envisioning. He says, "So to the boogie boys, the 3%ers and other right-wing paramilitary, and all the rest of you scared-ass rednecks, we're here. We're in your house. Let's go. NFAC." He is enticing the right wing. By the very definition of the term, strategy of tension, that's what we are seeing, a strategy of tension. We are seeing an SOT, strategy of tension. He is enticing the right. And what if the right wing responds violently? Then the black separatists would respond in kind. They would respond also with violence. And the whole situation could escalate into something pretty horrific. It's also very interesting that these people want to establish an ethno-state in Texas. That reminds me of the fact that the Texan separatists, people who want Texas to secede from the Union, they have ties to the Kremlin. We know that the Kremlin has invested into the secessionist movement. And by that, I mean there was a Russian activist by the name of Alexander Ionov who recently went to Texas, and he did some work with Texas secessionists. And Ionov is, I want to say he's the leader of an organization that is actually backed by the Kremlin. And it says here that Ionov runs the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia, a group that helps organize secession movements across the West and which has received financing from the Kremlin in the past. We also know that the Kremlin has been involved in stoking anti-Spanish sentiment in Catalonia and working with Catalonian nationalists in order to help their movement to fragment from Spain, essentially fragmenting the EU. We also know for a fact that in the 1920s, 1930s, the Soviet Union invested a bunch of money into the black separatist movement, the black communist separatist movement. And there's a quote that I want to read to you guys. This is a quote from Aussie.com. And it says here, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was every reason for black Americans, particularly in the Jim Crow South, to envision being citizens of another country, one either overseas or of their own creation. And as Theodore Draper covers in American Communism and Soviet Russia, while black nationalist Marcus Garvey was pushing for a permanent black homeland in Africa during the early 1920s, a black communist visionary named Cyril Briggs was advancing his plan for a colored, autonomous state in sparsely settled western states like Nevada. American communists like Briggs, however, were not able to find a way to make use of the discontent which Garveyism fed on, says Draper. And so Mother Russia, in the form of the Communist International Organization, or Comintern, decided to get involved. Comintern approved a $300,000 fund for propaganda purposes in Black America, and key African-American leaders and communist sympathizers were invited to Russia to be wooed by Lenin and other Soviet officials inside the Kremlin. One of those trained in Moscow was Lovett Fort Whitman, a Harlem bellman turned political activist whom Time magazine called the reddest of the blacks. What's also very interesting is that last year it was revealed that a very influential oligarch in Russia by the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is very well tied to the Kremlin, he had a number of associates who actually talked about manipulating and exploiting African Americans by radicalizing them against the US government. So we know for a fact that Russia has an interest in really stoking that African American anger against the US government in order to destabilize the Union. So it's very, very disturbing what's happening. The fact that you have these black separatist paramilitaries, and these guys are asking for reparations. They're saying that every black in America needs to have a lot of land because of slavery. It's like really, really crazy stuff. But imagine if they really begin to push this stuff hardcore. Imagine if it's not just these paramilitaries talking this way. Imagine if it's really popular black voices talking like this. Well, it's actually already happening. I mean, the idea of reparations is being pushed by some very influential African American voices, like that Charlemagne guy, and you also have that Mark Lamont Hill guy, who is really just a racist. In fact, there is a video of Mark Lamont Hill in his debate that he had recently with Candace Owens, in which he is saying that, well, yeah, businesses were destroyed during the George Floyd riots, but these weren't black-owned businesses. You know, these weren't businesses that black people owned, so, like, you know, basically, who cares? They deserved it.
There are people calling for defunding right now, and there are people on the streets. Just like King, there are people who are marching and getting beaten by police, and there are people who are tearing up Detroit in quads. Mm-hmm. I'm saying we need multiple strategies. Now, I agree with you. I would love if, and I got to say, I have a bookstore in Philadelphia, and a whole bunch of stores on my block got smashed. Sneaker store got raided. What else got raided? Another a hair store got raided. My bookstore did not. Right? My coffee shop did not. Now, why? Well, it's not nearly as random as you might think. Right? Much of the people, a lot of the stuff is, oh, you're tearing down your own shit. Most of this shit in our neighborhood isn't ours. Right? Most of it are people who are occupying our neighborhoods.
The guy is evil. He's just evil. And the fact is that you have black celebrity voices talking like these paramilitaries. And so the opinion of these paramilitaries, which is very, very radical, is also being said and being exclaimed by popular voices amongst African Americans. And it's very, very scary. Why is it scary? Because not only does it entice anti-white or anti-non-African racism, but it also entices the other side. That's what makes this so dangerous. It entices the other side. And that's what I mean by strategy of tension. You anger the whites to the point where violence is going to happen. That's what worries me more than anything. And they're talking about singing a black national anthem during a football game. All they're going to do is piss people off. Because I can tell you right now, when Colin Kaepernick was doing his little stunt and getting on a knee, all he was doing was pissing people off. And then you had Beyonce doing the Black Power fist during the Super Bowl, pissed a bunch of people off. All they're doing is pissing people off. And eventually, if they continue doing this, something's going to break. And it's not going to look good. And I know that most blacks, most African Americans, aren't really a part of this sort of ideological paradigm which hates whites, or they want to create some crazy black ethno-state. But the scary thing is that if enough of these people are out there, while there will be a minority, they will be big enough to spark a lot of damage. And if you do have civil unrest, a lot of innocent blacks will suffer. That's what always happens during these sorts of revolutionary movements. Like, look at the French Revolution. They talked about, helping the peasantry, but the peasants were the ones who suffered the most. It's the same thing. The Soviet Union, same thing happened. Who were the ones who suffered the most? The regular folk. So that's what makes this whole thing so nerve-wracking. It's this strategy of tension, trying to get both sides to kill each other. And what we have to do as a society is not fall for it. The best way to win this game is not to play. That's the best way to win this game, is not to play. Once you pick a side, then you are contributing to the chaos. Because if enough of these political fanatics get enough followers, then they become substantially dangerous. Look at what happened in Yugoslavia. Most people weren't involved in the fighting. Most people weren't involved in the ultra-nationalist activism that took place prior to the war in the 1990s. But there were enough people who were. And that group of people were big enough to tear the whole of Yugoslavia apart, and that led to the deaths of around 140,000 people. If you have a race war in the United States, blacks are going to suffer tremendously, as other Americans definitely would suffer. And it would look something like The Division. It's a video game. If you haven't played it, look it up on YouTube. And in that video game, it has black separatists, you have the very highly organized right-wing paramilitaries, you have the whole thing. And you can see this video game as really an illustration of what would happen if enough of these people act upon their ideological urges. So what we do know in this whole situation is you have a paramilitary calling for a black ethno-state. He is enticing right-wing paramilitaries to act violently, and that's just a strategy of tension. We know also that there was a police officer who was murdered in Oakland during a George Floyd protest. I believe this was back in May, and a lot of people automatically assumed that the killer was just some BLM activist, when the reality is that it was done by a right-wing fanatic who was a part of the Boogaloo movement. And this Grandmaster J guy, he is enticing the Boogaloos. The Boogaloos will be violent, and they have already been violent. That murder of that police officer in Oakland proved that. These people are willing to act violently. So we know that there's that. We know that there is that strategy of tension being done. And we know for a fact that the Kremlin has been involved for a long time in trying to radicalize African Americans against the government in order to destabilize the Union. We know for a fact that we have numerous entities and organizations and paramilitaries that want to see a right-wing revolt, or they want to see some sort of a race war or the formation of an ethno-state. We know for a fact that during the Cold War, NATO organized and backed and armed right-wing paramilitaries in order to cause a strategy of tension. So, while I can't prove for certain that this is what's happening, I'm seeing a pattern, and I'm simply just presenting that pattern, because it's quite paralleled with what happened in the past. So truly, the best way to win in this whole amalgamation of conspiracy and provocation is not to play. Do not fall for this game. What these people want to do is exactly what the Old Testament warned about when it talked about, and I think this is in the book of Isaiah, it says, neighbor shall fight against neighbor. And if these people get their way, that's what we're going to see. So the best way to prevent this is not to play the game. But the problem is that people are so enslaved to the paradigm of having to choose a side that I fear that not enough people are going to be astute enough to realize this. Anyway, I've talked long enough. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.